I'm Adrienne Fast, Curator of Art and Visual Culture at the Reach Gallery Museum. In this video, I'd like to introduce you to the artists Jorden and David Doody, a husband and wife team based in Kelowna, BC, whose work is featured in the exhibition The Dreaming Machine, on display at the Reach in our Fall-Winter 2021 season. The Doodys are known for their trippy, immersive sculptural installations that probe at the intersection between the virtual and the physical worlds, and which have a tendency to make our sense of visual perception feel off balance or perhaps unreliable. One of the ways the Doodys achieve this is by playing with scale and perspective. So, for example, the sculptural component of the exhibition includes a series of classically shaped archways with an expansive and boldly painted shadow, as well as two nearby figural sculptures, one draped in a metallic reflective textile with only the eyes visible, and the other consisting of only human leg shapes attached to a large collection of helium-filled balloons. The comparative scale of the figures and the archways, especially with the added visual weight of the painted shadow, is not easily or quickly apprehended, even when viewed in person. And the Doodys are well aware, in fact they revel, in the fact that images of their work often circulate far wider than the objects themselves. This video, for example, will be seen by people who were never able to visit the exhibition in person. That audience may never know that the figural sculptures are rendered in larger-than-life scale. These are in fact moderate giants. When experienced and understood only through digital reproduction, it could be hard or impossible to get a sense of one's own physical relationship to the objects in question. That much seems obvious. But even for those who do experience this installation in the flesh, so to speak, the sense of an off-kilter visual perspective persists. Personally, I can't tell you how many times I have ducked my head when walking through one of these archways, even though I know it is high enough for me to pass through easily. The Doodys have shifted the perspective just enough that my instinct is to duck. Now, we've been taught not to explicitly trust what we see on screens. That's nothing new. What the Doodys' work does is expand that uncertainty into the real physical world as well. The Dreaming Machine also includes a large number of two-dimensional paintings and drawings that have not previously been exhibited. Here, the Doodys continue to play with the distinctions between physical and virtual space and perception, often with explicit references to Western art history. Take the large-scale painting The Walking Jay, for example, which consists of a large, multi-figural shape on a bright red background, casting that same intensely blue shadow. Here, the Doodys have depicted a somewhat confusing but still recognizable group of figures, something that in the real world would occupy three-dimensional space. And if we think about the history of painting in the Western world, up until, say, the Impressionists, the goal of painting was to try to depict as accurately as possible on a two-dimensional surface the experience of three-dimensional space. Shading and shadowing, receding perspective, photographic realism, all of these tools were developed and celebrated for making it seem like, as a viewer, you could step into the picture. The Doodys instead have rendered this figural group in extreme two dimensions, completely flat as a silhouette only. And they've filled it with a pattern that recalls the kind of spatial studies that have been used since the Renaissance to teach apprentice artists how to master linear receding perspective. Imagine this pattern covering the floor of a courtyard, for example, how the artist would angle and shape the pattern to make it appear as if it receded into the distance. This pattern, too, the Doodys have tipped flat onto the surface, rejecting it entirely as a tool for spatial realism, and enjoying it instead for its decorative value. The sharply receding blue shadow, meanwhile, does add a gesture towards that ideal of spatial realism, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of what other painting tries to do, but this painting joyously does not. The Doodys revel in this plucking of images or patterns from their original context or purpose, and their reinsertion into different contexts. Elsewhere in their paintings and on the sculptural archways, we see a rendering of a pattern that resembles a kind of digital glitch. Now, I'm old enough to remember the kind of old television set that we had to dial into different channels by gently turning the knob, like on a radio. In between clear channels were fields of pure visual distortion. the kind of static that most of us just rushed past in order to get to the realistic representation we were after. The Doodys instead zoom in on that visual distortion itself. They evacuate the so-called content of realism to focus on the pattern itself, and ask their viewer what it means when it is extracted from the context of meaningless in-between, and instead is made the subject of a painting, the subject of our gaze. What happens when something strictly visual and virtual and digital is given physical shape and space? It has been argued that the postmodern experience is characterized by this kind of dislocation of images from their origins and their infinite replication and reinsertion into new formats and contexts. But the Doodys know too much about art history to be content in thinking that this is a purely postmodern phenomenon. There is a subtle reference to this in the classical bust shape, rendered in pink and blue, that sits on a block in the sculptural area of the exhibition. This bust is based on a copy of a classical bust that the Doodys discovered in a thrift store, in which they have remade multiple times in various different materials, scales, and colors. This classical shape is reminiscent of ancient Greek sculpture, long considered the ideal model for all subsequent Western art. But the fact is that almost everything we know about ancient Greek bronze sculpture we have learned through Roman copies made hundreds of years later out of marble, because so few Greek originals survive. We have been learning about the world through copies, adaptations, and misquotations for millennia. Each copy, each new context brings its own meaning, valuable for its own reasons. The same bust seen resting on a block in the exhibition space is also the same bust seen behind the reflective textile of the moderately giant figural sculpture nearby. They are the same, and yet they are not the same at all. Replication, copying, and recontextualizing brings about its own unique value. Thank you for listening, and please visit www.thereach.ca for more information about upcoming exhibitions and videos. Thank you.